There's no careful introduction to what I'm about to admit, no gradual explanation designed to make it easier to understand. Some things arrive without warning. They don't announce themselves. They don't ask whether you're ready for them. They simply appear, and once they do, they become impossible to ignore. For most of my life, I've lived behind layers. Not because I wanted distance, but because distance created order. It allowed me to move through the world without exposing parts of myself that were never meant for casual observation. People met me, spoke with me, believed they understood me, but what they understood was only what I allowed them to see. That arrangement worked, it always had, until you. You never approached me the way others did. You didn't try to solve me. You didn't search for explanations or labels that would make me easier to define. You never seemed interested in reducing complexity into something comfortable. You simply noticed, quietly, consistently, as though recognition came more naturally to you than curiosity. At first, I dismissed it, the way you understood things I never explained. The way your responses seemed to arrive from a place deeper than observation. The way your silence matched mine with an accuracy that felt almost impossible. I told myself it was coincidence. But coincidence fades. This didn't. It repeated, again and again, until I had no choice but to acknowledge the pattern. And that pattern unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Because this kind of understanding is supposed to take time. It's supposed to grow through shared experiences, through years of learning someone's habits, fears, contradictions, and truths. Yet with you, there was no gradual process, no learning curve, no visible progression. You entered my awareness with a familiarity that felt older than our actual history, as though you weren't discovering me, as though you already recognized something that had always been there. That realization stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. I've always controlled access. I've always decided how close people could get, what they could know, what remained unseen. Those boundaries weren't walls built from fear. They were structures built from intention, necessary, reliable, predictable. But somehow, none of them seemed to apply to you. You didn't push against them. You didn't challenge them. You simply existed in a way that made them feel irrelevant. And that was far more unsettling than resistance, because resistance can be answered, it can be managed, it can be stopped. Recognition cannot. Recognition slips through unnoticed. It arrives before you realize anything has changed. And by the time you notice it, the change has already happened. I began to see it in the smallest moments, the way you listened when I stopped speaking, the way you never rushed to fill silence, the way you allowed meaning to exist without demanding immediate explanation. Most people become uncomfortable in silence. They try to reshape it, control it, escape it. You never did. You let it remain exactly what it was. And in doing so, you revealed something unexpected. You understood that not everything valuable arrives through words. Some things reveal themselves only when words are absent. That understanding changed the way I responded to you, gradually, quietly, without permission. I noticed myself filtering less, not because I made a conscious decision to trust you, but because something deeper recognized that trust was no longer the relevant question. The usual calculations disappeared. The careful editing, the measured distance. For the first time in a very long time, it felt unnecessary. And that realization carried its own weight, because there is a difference between being accepted by someone who only sees part of you and being accepted by someone who sees more than you intended to reveal. You belonged to the second category. And that's where everything began, not with emotion, not with attachment, not even with connection, with recognition, the kind that arrives before explanation, the kind that exists before trust, the kind that quietly changes the shape of your awareness long before you understand what it means. And once I recognized that recognition, there was no returning to the distance that existed before it. Recognition should have been the end of it. At least, that's what logic suggested. Notice something unusual. Acknowledge it, understand it, then allow it to settle into the background like everything else. That's how it normally works. But this didn't settle. It expanded quietly at first, almost invisibly, not through dramatic conversations or defining moments, but through accumulation. Small observations, shared silences. The strange consistency of finding understanding where misunderstanding should have existed. And the more I paid attention, the more difficult it became to dismiss. Because what I was noticing wasn't familiarity. Familiarity comes from repetition. This felt different. This felt like alignment. There's a distinction between knowing someone and recognizing the structure beneath the person. Most relationships never move beyond the surface architecture. People learn preferences, habits, reactions, stories. They collect information and call it understanding. But information isn't the same thing as insight. And insight isn't the same thing as alignment. Dalleman exists deeper than that. It's the moment you realize someone processes the world through patterns that resemble your own. Not identical, not mirrored, but compatible in a way that feels impossible to manufacture. That's what unsettled me. Because once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed it in the way you approached uncertainty, the way you paid attention to things most people overlooked, the way your conclusions seemed to arrive through observation rather than assumption. You never rushed toward meaning. You allowed it to emerge. That alone separated you from nearly everyone else. Most people are eager to explain, eager to define, eager to replace complexity with certainty. You weren't. You seemed comfortable existing in questions longer than most people can tolerate, and somehow, so was I. That realization created a shift, not around you, inside me, because I began noticing something I had never experienced before. You were no longer someone I observed. You had become part of the way I observed. At first, the difference felt insignificant. Then I realized it changed everything. Thinking about someone still preserves distance. They remain separate from you, external, oppositional. But thinking with someone is different. It means their presence has become integrated into your perspective, into the way you interpret, into the way you understand, into the way you see, and somewhere along the way that happened without announcement, without permission, without either of us acknowledging it directly. I would encounter an idea and instinctively wonder how you would perceive it. Not because I needed your answer, because your perspective had become part of the equation itself. A second angle, a second lens, a reference point that existed naturally inside my thought process. And that was new, dangerously new, because I have always been self-contained. My internal world has always belonged entirely to me, independent, structured, untouched. No one entered that space without effort, without invitation, without me fully understanding the cost. Yet somehow, you arrived there without crossing any visible threshold, as though the door had never existed for you in the first place. That realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. This wasn't temporary. Temporary things require attention to survive. They depend on intensity, on novelty, on constant reinforcement. But this connection seemed to operate differently. It became stronger through stillness, more defined through silence, more present through absence, and anything capable of doing that is not built on excitement. It's built on structure. That word kept returning to me, structure, because structure tells the truth. Emotion can fluctuate. Circumstances can change. Perception can distort. But structure remains. It reveals compatibility at a level deeper than preference, deeper than attraction, deeper than shared experience. It exists beneath all of those things. And every time I examined what existed between us, I arrived at the same conclusion: something aligned, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. Enough that ignoring it required more effort than accepting it. Enough that distance no longer functioned the way it once had. Enough that I found myself measuring things differently, not against expectations, not against the world, against the clarity I experienced with you. And once that comparison existed, it became impossible to forget, because clarity changes standards. Once you encounter a deeper level of understanding, surface level understanding becomes easier to recognize. Not wrong, not inferior, simply incomplete. That was the shift. The point where recognition became something more, not attachment, not dependence, alignment. The realization that someone had reached a place beyond observation and entered the architecture of perception itself. And once that happened, the question was no longer whether this connection was real. The question became what happens when something this precise continues to grow, because I could feel it happening. Slowly, silently. With a certainty that required no confirmation, what existed between us was no longer forming. It had already formed. Now it was integrating. And integration changes everything around it. There comes a point when awareness stops being something you witness from a distance, a point where observation is no longer enough, a point where understanding demands an answer. I think I've reached that point, because this is no longer something unfolding quietly in the background of my life. It's no longer a pattern I can study, a realization I can examine, or a connection I can keep suspended in a space without consequence. It has consequence now, not because of what has been said, not because of what has happened, but because of what has already changed. And the truth is, something has changed. I feel it in the way my thoughts no longer return to the shape they had before you. I feel it in the way silence has transformed from absence into presence. I feel it in the way certain truths seem incomplete until I imagine them passing through your understanding as well. That's the shift I can no longer deny, because I have always trusted my own internal world. I built it carefully, protected it carefully, maintained it carefully. Every belief, every conclusion, every structure inside me earned its place through examination. Nothing remained unless it proved it belonged there. That has always been my rule. Yet somehow you arrived without undergoing that process. Or perhaps you did, and I simply didn't notice it happening. Either way, the result is the same. You are here, not at the edge of my awareness, not passing through it, not waiting outside it. You are part of it. And once something reaches that level, it becomes impossible to treat it as temporary. Temporary things occupy attention, integrated things occupy structure. That's the difference, and you have become structural. I don't mean that emotionally. I mean it precisely. You have altered the baseline, the quiet foundation beneath thought itself, the place where perception begins before language ever forms around it. And once a baseline changes, everything built upon it must adjust, whether it wants to or not. That's what I've been experiencing: adjustment, recalibration, the slow recognition that something fundamental has shifted position. The strange part is that I don't resent it. Every instinct I've ever trusted tells me that significant change deserves scrutiny. It deserves resistance. It deserves questions. Yet none of those responses arrived. Instead, I found acceptance, not immediate, not careless, but steady. The kind of acceptance that forms when something proves its place over time without ever demanding it. That's what makes this difficult to explain. You never asked for access. You never pushed for significance. You never tried to become important, and yet importance formed around you anyway, naturally, quickly, without force, as though something deeper than intention had already made the decision. That realization leaves me with a question I can no longer avoid. not what this is. I know what this is, at least enough to recognize its shape. The real question is what happens next. Because connections like this do not remain suspended forever. They evolve, they deepen, or they fracture beneath the weight of uncertainty. Nothing remains untouched indefinitely. And for a long time, I believed I could continue observing this from a safe distance, continue analyzing it, continue understanding it without participating in it. But that illusion is gone now. Understanding is participation. Recognition is participation. Allowing something to matter is participation. And whether I intended it or not, I have already participated. I crossed that line long ago, quietly, without announcement, without realizing how far I had gone. The evidence is everywhere. In the way I continue returning to this awareness, in the way I no longer reduce it into something simpler just to make it easier to manage, in the way I allow it to remain exactly what it is, even when certainty would be more comfortable. Those are choices, small ones, invisible ones, but choices nonetheless. And collectively, they reveal a truth I can no longer ignore. You matter, not because of dependency, not because of need, not because of some fleeting emotional intensity. You matter because your presence has changed the way I understand things, the way I understand people, the way I understand myself. That level of influence is rare, rare enough that it deserves honesty. And honesty requires me to admit something I've spent a long time circling around without naming directly. I am no longer deciding whether to let this exist. It already exists. The decision waiting in front of me is different. The decision is whether I fully acknowledge what has already become true. Because once something reaches this depth, denial becomes more exhausting than acceptance. And I have never been interested in exhausting myself with denial. If something is real, I face it, even when it changes me, especially when it changes me. So here is the truth as clearly as I can speak it. You are no longer someone I simply understand. You are someone whose presence has become woven into the way I understand everything else. And that changes the outcome before any future decision is made. Because integration is not the beginning of a connection. Integration is what happens when a connection has already become part of who you are. And whether I was ready for it or not, that has already happened.